There's a really problematic trend spreading across fitness right now. You've probably seen it. A flashy video with bar charts, measurements, and the illusion of hard data. The title promises the truth, the best rep range, the best exercise, and the most shocking result. And the creator says, we ran an experiment. But here's the thing, they didn't. These so-called influencer science experiments are not science. They're stories dressed up to look like science. And while they might seem harmless, maybe even educational, they're quietly pulling us backwards. The first time I really noticed this and started thinking about it was when I saw Jeff Nippard launch his muscle lab. Jeff brought in equipment, started running his own mini experiments, and packaged them into slick, well-produced videos. At the same time, Jeremy here has posted about training one side of his body with heavy weights and the other with light weights, to see whether over a period of 60 days, one of the two approaches would be superior. Jesse James West started working on a twin experiment, looking at the impact of steroid use on muscle gains. And years before that, EMG videos had already paved the way. Influencers strapping electrodes to their delts and biceps, and then declaring, this is the best exercise. It's the same pattern. Old idea, new packaging. More polished thumbnails, higher budgets, bigger audiences. So, why are influencers doing this? The answer is simple, because it works. Running these experiments signals authority. It positions them as scientists, not content creators. Not just people repeating what the literature says, but people creating knowledge. It makes for a great story. Experiments are made for storytelling. We love the setup, the test, the reveal. It's the classic 3-act structure, and YouTube's algorithm rewards it. Plus, the visuals are compelling. When you film your own experiment, the B-roll practically creates itself. Electrode close-ups, DEXA measurements, participants training, subjects sharing their experiences, time lapses of study procedures, versus a clip of me saying, a meta-analysis found limited evidence for this effect. Guess which one makes for a better video? And let's not forget, these videos give influencers total creative control. In real science, your methods need to pass the sniff test, or your study won't get published. Other labs have to replicate your work before it's considered a reliable finding. On YouTube, you design the test, run it once, edit the footage, and draw whatever conclusion will resonate most with your viewers. And this isn't just a fitness thing. It's part of the wider Mr. Beastification of YouTube. The platform rewards spectacle. Big, bold experiments, hyperbolic descriptions of the most extreme setup with dramatic results. Jeff has even collaborated with Mr. Beast himself, which makes sense. Mr. Beast perfected this formula. But when you import that style into fitness, the risk is you end up prioritizing shock value over truth. The incentives push you towards experiments that look exciting, not methods that are actually reliable. Jeff's one-year experiment ended with a conclusion that advanced lifters can still grow without steroids. It was a powerful story, but the fact it worked out the way it did was incredibly fortunate. And audiences love it. To the casual viewer, it looks like reinvestment into the community. Influencers spending their own money and time on science. It feels noble, but it's not science. It's branding. That's why this trend is exploding. The incentives reward it. A video titled, "We Found the Best Biceps Exercise Experiment" will appeal to way more viewers than "Does exercise selection influence biceps muscle growth?" But why are influencers mostly running self-experiments and twin studies? Well, it's simple. Actual research is hard, really hard. Properly designing a study alone can take months. Then you're not just grabbing your training partner and calling it a day. You need enough people to have statistical power, usually dozens of participants. Then, you've got to get their informed consent, familiarize them with the study's procedures, collect measurements, train each participant several times a week. That usually takes a team of 3 to 10 researchers working full-time for months. Then comes the analysis, the write-up, peer review, revisions, all before a single result ever gets published. And that's if the study even gets approved in the first place, because you also need ethical approval, funding, and institutional support. Compare that to filming yourself for 6 weeks and slapping a before and after on a thumbnail. It's night and day. And that's why most influencer experiments aren't really experiments. They're shortcuts that look scientific but skip the hard part. Here's the problem. Science works because of large sample sizes, forming a consensus of multiple replicated studies and a long enough time frame to actually observe differences. Evidence-based practice relies on the hierarchy of evidence. At the top are meta-analyses and randomized controlled trials, large, replicated studies that minimize random noise. And at the very bottom, anecdotes. Now, what do influencer experiments give us? N equals 1. Maybe N equals 2 if you count twins. That's anecdote, the weakest form of evidence possible. And even the twin study idea is deeply flawed. Yes, twins share DNA, but they don't share identical motivation, effort, or recovery. One might train harder, eat slightly differently, or just sleep worse. Any difference you see could easily come from that noise, not the training itself. Just because they're twins doesn't magically turn a sample size of 2 into a well-powered study. I genuinely believe that putting out a video built around a sample this small isn't just weak evidence, it's doing a disservice to the whole industry, because the average viewer can't tell the difference between a one-person trial and a proper study. To them, it all looks like science. And then there's EMG, a method that measures electrical activity in a muscle, often misused as a proxy for hypertrophy. The problem? EMG doesn't predict growth, yet influencers turned EMG traces into flashy graphs and used them to prove which exercise was best. Yes, some influencers now talk about running actual studies, and that's better. If they fund real peer-reviewed research with larger samples, that is a genuine contribution. People like Jeff Nippard, Brett Contreras, Menno Henselmans, Mike Israetel. They've all put money into proper studies, and that deserves a lot of credit. I think they've done more for evidence-based fitness than almost anyone in the space. But most influencer experiments aren't that. And even when someone runs a real study, the risk is the same. The results of that single publicized study will get overemphasized while the broader body of evidence gets ignored. The point is this: there's a reason the hierarchy of evidence exists. Without it, you can justify anything. And influencer experiments collapse that hierarchy down to the very bottom, while pretending they're at the top. Let's go down one level deeper. Why is n equals 1 or n equals 2 such a problem? Because small samples don't just miss real effects, they inflate false ones. In neuroscience, a study by Button and colleagues demonstrated that small sample size, underpowered studies lead to exaggerated effect sizes. If your study is too small, the effects you do find aren't just uncertain, they're almost certainly overstated. Now, the same is very likely true in exercise science. Murphy and colleagues found that most published findings in exercise science, even from real labs with dozens of participants and peer review, only 28% of those demonstrated robust replicability. Think about that. If even real science struggles to produce reliable conclusions, what are the odds that an influencer's 30-day, one-man experiment produces a trustworthy finding? Add in day-to-day variance, lower adherence to measurement protocols, and less reliable measurements in the first place, and the results are often going to be random noise. But if you package that noise in a slick thumbnail and with a dramatic graph, it suddenly looks groundbreaking. And speaking of experiments, one thing we actually do have a mountain of solid evidence for is creatine. It's the most studied supplement in sports nutrition, and it reliably improves strength and muscle growth. The problem? Most people forget to take it. That's why I like Tasty Gains Creatine gummies. They taste good, they're convenient, and they make it almost impossible to miss a dose. If you want to support the channel and your training at the same time, check out my sponsor through the link below. Alright, back to it. And that's the danger. So, what do we end up with? The same flaws that plague real science: publication bias, small sample sizes, confirmation bias, but without even the minimal checks and balances that academia has. No peer review, no replication, no scientist co-author saying, hang on, are you sure? It's all the same stuff science gets criticized for, but turbocharged by the incentives of social media. Now, you might wonder, if these experiments are so flawed, why do they resonate so strongly with viewers? The answer is that they scratch two powerful itches. First, the itch for clarity. Training is confusing. People want clear, simple answers. Which exercise is best? Should I train to failure? Does high volume beat low volume? Influencer experiments promise those answers in a 10-minute package without the complexity and time cost of real science. Second, the itch for novelty. Real science is slow and incremental. A single study might nudge your confidence one way or the other. But influencer experiments cut straight to the big reveal, a bold answer wrapped in a compelling story. And that's way more watchable than a systematic review suggested a small but uncertain effect. That's why these videos blow up, not because they're rigorous, but because they're compelling. They tell you what you want to hear in the way that you want to hear it. This is why the incentive structure matters. A study by Smaldino and colleagues made a key point. Bad science doesn't persist because scientists are stupid. It persists because the system rewards it. Publish flashy results, you get citations, tenure, and funding. Publish boring, null findings, you get ignored. Influencers are in the same exact trap, only instead of tenure, the reward is views, sponsorships, and revenue. The algorithm doesn't care if your experiment is methodologically robust. It cares if it's clickable and the topic is controversial. So influencers adapt. They design experiments to maximize clicks, not validity. And that creates a vicious cycle. It's the same logic that fueled bro science in the bodybuilding magazines of the 70s and 80s. Writers didn't care if the advice was consistent. They cared if it sold magazines. It didn't matter that the advice was based on the results of a single or a handful of people. They cared if it sold. The only difference is now the medium is YouTube instead of muscle and fitness. And here's why I think this matters more than people realize. Let me be clear. Exercise science is the best tool we have. But if we let influencer experiments stand in for exercise science, we erode the distinction between what looks scientific and what is scientific. We collapse the hierarchy of evidence. Suddenly, an N=1 experiment with a cool thumbnail carries the same weight in people's minds as a meta-analysis of 20 studies. That's dangerous, because when you flatten that hierarchy, every claim looks equally valid. Incline curls are useless for growth starts to sound just as credible as several randomized controlled trials have shown substantial biceps growth from the incline curl. And when that happens, we're not doing science anymore. We're doing theater. Now, if you've made it this far, I know what some of you are probably thinking, but Jeff Nippert is a good guy. He actually reads research. He's not out here scamming people. Or Milo, aren't you doing the same thing? Using science as content, selling an app. Or even, this just sounds like you're stirring up controversy to get clicks. And honestly, those are fair points. Let's unpack them. First, yes, people like Jeff Nippert or Jeremy Ethier or others I've mentioned, they're not malicious. Most of them genuinely want to educate. And I know Jeff and Jeremy personally, and I know how much time they spend reading and double-checking the research. The issue isn't that they're bad people, it's that the system incentivizes them to produce content that looks like science, but isn't. Making YouTube videos is already a lot of work. Trying to run a study alongside it just isn't realistic for many. YouTube rewards drama, not nuance. Instagram rewards visuals, not citations. When you're trying to survive in that ecosystem, you naturally lean into simple but weak experiments, because you get more engagement than saying, the evidence is mixed. Second, am I doing the same thing? In some ways, yes. I also make content about science, and I also run a business. The difference is, I'm not pretending that my personal anecdotes are evidence. If I cite a study, it's a study. If I tell my coaching experience, I'll flag it as an anecdote. That distinction matters. Third, controversy. Look, I don't enjoy calling out trends in the industry. My channel usually focuses on applying exercise science studies into your training. It makes me uncomfortable because it can often come off as petty or jealous. But if we don't talk about this stuff, the line between science and storytelling just keeps eroding. And then we all lose. Before social media, this was already happening. For decades, people argued whether high or low training volumes were best for hypertrophy. The classic example, the Colorado experiment. Casey Viator reportedly gained over 60 pounds of muscle in just a month on low volume, high intensity workouts. Sounds incredible, but in reality, he'd lost a ton of muscle beforehand and was simply regaining it. He was a genetic outlier, heavily supervised and almost certainly enhanced. That single case became legendary, just like today's influencer experiments, but it doesn't reflect the broader evidence. In fact, I'd wager far more people know about the Colorado experiment than any single study on training volume. Meta-analyses show training volume is one of the strongest predictors of hypertrophy. More weekly sets generally means more growth, up to a point. So here's the difference. The experiment gives you a simple, dramatic story. The science gives you context, showing that most people respond better to higher volumes, but they can still train with low volumes and see gains. Which perspective is more useful in the long run? This is the core danger. Influencer experiments borrow the authority of science without following the methods of science. And once that authority is borrowed, it's powerful. Because if you see someone with electrodes on their chest, or twins in a side-by-side comparison, or even just a bar graph, it feels like the truth. But feeling like science and being science are not the same thing. That's why we have evidence hierarchies. That's why we run randomized controlled trials. That's why we publish meta-analyses. Not because scientists enjoy bureaucracy, but because those methods protect us from our own biases. When you skip that process and just film yourself training differently for 6 weeks, you're not discovering the truth. You're playing scientist for the camera. Here's the bottom line. If you're trying to build muscle efficiently, you can't let influencer experiments guide your training decisions. Remember, N=1 isn't evidence. Anecdote plus flashy editing doesn't equal a study. A self-experiment or single twin pair study is the bro science equivalent of "it worked for me." And a dramatic YouTube reveal should never outweigh decades of research. Use these videos as entertainment if you want. Let them spark curiosity, but don't let them replace actual science. Because once you collapse the hierarchy of evidence, you're not training smarter. You're just training in circles. The rise of influencer science experiments might look harmless, even fun, but here's the uncomfortable truth. If we let them replace real research, we're not moving forward, moving backwards. Back in the 70s and 80s, bodybuilding was dominated by bro science. Magazines sold programs with Arnold's photo slapped on top. Authority was the evidence. Today it's the same game, but with a twist. Only now, the authority isn't Arnold. It's the relatable influencer. Someone just like you. He trains like you, he eats like you, he reads the latest research like you. but he's gone out of his way to buy a bit of lab equipment so he can find out, for all of us, which exercise is best. That relatability is powerful. It feels trustworthy, but it's still anecdote. It's still theater. And if we let it replace proper evidence, meta-analyses, systematic reviews, then we're not moving forward. We're just reinventing bro science with better lighting and a nicer thumbnail. So what should you do the next time you see one of these influencer experiments? First, treat it as a story, not as evidence. If it sparks your curiosity, great. But don't change your program based on one person's n=1 trial. Second, zoom out. Ask yourself, what does the broader evidence say? If an influencer runs a small experiment, but then uses it as a starting point to highlight what systematic reviews and meta-analyses actually show, that's great. That's how you use a story to lead people into the bigger picture. I like to think we did that with our range of motion study in 2024. The video started with our own results, but then we zoomed out to cover the overall state of the research. That's what made it frustrating when people later claimed our study had disproved length and partials. It didn't. It was just one piece of the puzzle. But if a small sample experiment is treated as proof on its own without tying it back to the full body of research, that's when it becomes misleading. Third, watch for red flags. If someone is using surface EMG to make inferences about muscle growth or showing only their 30-day experiment results without tying it back to actual research, that's not science. That's showmanship. And finally, remember incentives and publication bias. If a result looks too dramatic, ask yourself, is this the truth or is this what the algorithm wanted? At the end of the day, I don't think most influencers are malicious. I think they're caught in a system that rewards drama over truth. But that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because if we blur the line between science and storytelling, we end up right back where we started. Confused, misled, and wasting time. Bro Science 2.0. Only this time, it's wearing a lab coat. That's the video. Before you go, a quick reminder. If you want a science-based way to actually program your training, check out MyoAdapt, the app I co-created. It builds routines based on the actual evidence, tailored to your schedule and goals. No fake experiments, just the fundamentals applied in the most efficient way possible. The link's in the description, and you can use code WOLF for a free 2-week trial. Alternatively, I also offer one-to-one coaching. You can book a free call to see if we're a good fit in the description. Finally, for any of the clothes you see me wear, check out rascalapparel.com and use code WOLF at checkout for a discount. Thank you for watching, stay skeptical, stay evidence-based, and I'll see you in that next one.